And now we will move on to Carly Silver. So Carly is a public historian and associate editor for HarperCollins. She brings the weird, wacky, and wonderful aspects of the ancient world to vivid, sparkling life in her work. She's written feature articles in BBC News, History Today, JSTOR Daily, Smithsonian, Atlas Obscura, The Atlantic, Narratively, ThoughtCo/About.com, for which she served as an ancient/classical history expert, biblical archaeology, Eidolon, archaeology, All That's Interesting, and other publications. So quite a substantial list there. A resident of Brooklyn, New York, Carly has presented at academic conferences at Pomona College and Trinity College, Dublin. Learn more about her work at carlysilver.com. Follow her on Twitter at Carly A. Silver, or keep up with her on Instagram at Bespectacled Legend. And today she is going to talk to us. She's going to give a talk entitled Meet the Vanguard of the Ancient World. So go ahead, Carly.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be presenting today on the vanguard of the ancient world, drawing parallels between cult leaders past and present. Here are my social links, as you can see here. However, there's one thing that I'd like to just start with. I'd like to just include a content warning. Just so you know, this talk will focus heavily on sexual abuse in the context of religious cults, both ancient and modern. If you or someone you know would like help to deal with sexual or religious abuse, please visit the links here or reach out to any of those of us who have been organizing this wonderful conference. One second, I'm having a little bit of a trouble with screen sharing. There we go. There's some wonderful resources provided here. So to start off with, the American leader of a new religious movement, or NRM, is often depicted as a charismatic male leader that takes advantage of vulnerable individuals in the guise of helping them. In a 2012 study, 3 sociologists examined why NRMs with charismatic male leaders often tend to be made up of female followers. They posed the question, why do women like charismatic male leaders or identify with their following, even when those men lead groups with patriarchal ideologies that that discriminate against women? These scholars suggested the spiritual leader, often referred to as a guru, subverts gender roles, but in a way that actually ends up reinforcing them. They noted, quote, since the guru-disciple relation is seen as one linking a giver of spiritual knowledge and a receiver, the ideal disciple psychology is gender traditionally feminine, hence valorizing the position of female disciples. They then added, but if gender ideology is crucial, it might be that members join the group with certain gender ideologies that are related to their willingness to accord status to other members. Thus, people who knowingly or unknowingly bind to the feminine as sort of disciples of a male leader might wind up sort of more inclined to follow a charismatic male leader who proclaims to be freeing women even as he restricts them. Now, this man here may look familiar. Nowhere has this been clearer than in recent years in the news. In 2018, Nexium, not to be confused with the antacid of the same name, made headlines when D-list celebrities were revealed to have brainwashed young women into being sex slaves for a cult based out of Albany in upstate New York. Women like actress Allison Mack enlisted female followers into a cult in the guise of joining a self-improvement organization headed by the man shown here called Keith Rainier, also known as the Vanguard. Amongst Rainier's many, many crimes, he brainwashed and pressured his followers into sleeping with them, raped women and professed that they liked being assaulted, and played his subordinates off one another so they vied for his favor. He and his minions also starved these women to submission, restricted their movements, branded women like cattle, and of course he was allowed to do as he pleased. Now, the idea of a modern cult is not one that is, we imagine it as existing on the fringes of society, barely tolerated by some. But in antiquity, we get cults that were acknowledged, even supported by the state. We get some that were maybe a little more, in some of their quote unquote wilder elements, were deemed not fit for proper society by the daylight and in the corner, in the center of a city. But there's also, the two don't really seem to overlap ancient and modern cults until we get to a fellow I like to call the original vanguard, a man named Alexander of Abinatacus. Both this vanguard and the ancient vanguard were said to have concocted schemes to manipulate and deceive, elevate themselves beyond their actual merits to positions of religious authority, and gain their wealth from their believers. So this red X you can see up here is approximately the location of Abinatacus. It was a fairly minor city in Asia Minor. We are dealing with the 2nd century CE. And again, located right along the Black Sea here. Now, Alexander of Abnotakis is, like it sounds, comes from the city of Abnotakis. We get most of his life thanks to the writer and satirist Lucian. And of course, Lucian doesn't hesitate to make fun of tons of Alexander's deeds. And so there is always the question of, what is his agenda when writing? Is he writing a satirical piece? It's not going to be a straight up biography, insofar as one could say that even exists at this period in time, which one could argue that it doesn't necessarily. But Lucian begins his satire of Alexander comparing our Alexander of Abnotakis to Alexander the Great, quipping that, quote, one was as great in villainy as the other in heroism. Our Alexander is a brigand of the worst kind, posits Lucian, because he dupes the educated people of the cities into believing his nonsense. And he didn't just infect the provinces, but he filled the whole Roman Empire with his beliefs. Luckily for our young Alexander, he had two big things going for him. He was handsome and clever. Lucian bemoans how Alexander's beautiful exterior belied his rotten interior. And of course, by the height of his prophesizing, Alexander enhanced his natural good looks with either hair extensions or a wig. There's something about, in this previous picture of Rainier, we have him having sort of like a shortish haircut, but there is something about him about cult leaders having very long hair and long beards that does come up quite a bit throughout history, but that's a subject for another time. Alexander also had a good speaking voice, one that was deemed very sweet and clear, and was perceived to match his comely outside with the beautiful inside. Now, Lucian records that Alexander was a bit of a go-getter, but a go-getter through dishonest means. Lucian stated that Alexander became a sex worker at a young age, a youth who, quote, trafficked freely in his attractiveness and sold his company to those who sought it. He found a snake oil salesman, not literal in this case, although snakes do pop up, as you'll see shortly. And that snake oil salesman, who I dubbed Dr. Devious, saw a protege worth cultivating, both sexually and professionally. And this unnamed mentor of Alexander's is given a rather unique lineage. He is not said to be royal or divine in any case, but he was a protege of the notorious Apollonius of Tyana, who was a sort of a known prophet miracle worker that was wandering around, or that was sort of itinerant and a bit notorious during this time period. So Lucian is drawing on a sort of almost like there was like a philosopher would have an intellectual heritage. This person was the disciple of that person. Alexander was essentially the grand disciple of Apollonius of Tyana. And he doesn't even have to bother describing the types of things in which Alexander was schooled. Name dropping Apollonius pretty much does it. So Alexander decided that he was going to, follow along with Dr. Devious and sort of, travel a bit about the empire. Now, where does Keith Rainier fit into this dynamic? Whether or not Alexander or Rainier really ever believed in their own propaganda is almost immaterial. Both ended up tapping into existing belief structures to build up myths about themselves. Rainier dove deep into literature by and about geniuses from a young age and patterned himself after his figures. He read Isaac Asimov's The Second Foundation, which centers on a brilliant scientist who has reduced all human behavior to mathematical equations. Rainier believed that he could attain that type of knowledge and impart it to others. He also fell in love with the literature of Ayn Rand and really married the ruthless nature of the protagonists of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged with his idea that people should really focus on what they want, their truth, and just go and get whatever you wanted. Now, when I was mentioning Alexander as a false prophet, we haven't quite gotten to his prophecies, but a little bit about the area in which we're operating at the moment. There's a venerable tradition of itinerant preachers or quote unquote wandering holy men, which is a very debatable category, the idea of the theos aner in Greek, but sort of the idea of prophets sort of browsing or, popping up in different areas in Asia Minor at this point is one that is also identified with the healing gods Esclepius and Apollo. In 144, we get the orator Publius Aelius Aristides feeling ill, so he goes to Smyrna in Asia Minor. Aristides says that Esclepius visited him in a dream, and Asclepius, of course, being the god of healing, and tells him to walk on bare feet from Smyrna to nearby Pergamon, where he would be healed at the temple of Asclepius. This is an example of what remains of one Asclepion. Now, the way a person would be healed in Asclepion would be that they would seek medical help, pay for a sacrifice and or a votive offering in the shape of their ailing body part, would be dedicated in their name to a god. Then they'd have a sleepover in the sanctuary. And in theory, the god would then visit him in his sleep and tell them what remedy they would need to cure that that whatever part of themselves was ailing them. So Alexander ended up traveling throughout Asia Minor and ended up going into Macedonia at one point, and ended up really sort of being fascinated by Esclepius and these, whether local priests of sanctuaries of Esclepius or some of the wandering individuals that he probably met. So he and a friend who was a choral singer of his ended up touring the countryside, practicing what was called quackery and sorcery by Lucian. They ended up then traveling to Macedonia with a wealthy advisor from Pella, and this woman ended up showing them these magnificent snakes that were supposedly worn by the women of Macedonia, almost like shawls around themselves. And Alexander, that really resonated with him because the snakes were highly associated with Esclepius, and his father Apollo were associated with prophecy and with healing. So Alexander and his friend bought some snakes and brought them home with them. And he had noticed along the way that priests and gatekeepers who attended on actual prophets or temples where prophecies were given out had become uber wealthy from bribes, offerings, tributes to the god. And Alexander said, this is what I'm going to do when I get home. I'm going to take this snake. I am going to declare myself essentially an avatar or son of Esclepius, and I'm going to become a prophet, because if they did it, why can't I? And if there's one thing he knew how to do from all of this sort of this lineage that Lucian had established for him, it was how to persuade gullible people. So he and his friends came home and spread word that there was a divine manifestation of Esclepius coming to Abanatacus. He dressed to the nines like a prophet. He had long ringlets and a sword, and prophets oftentimes were thought to foam at the mouth at the idea that there was a divine possession. Alexander chewed a root called soapwort in order to look like he was divinely possessed. Once he heard that there was going to be a local temple of Esclepius built, he snuck in at one night, took a very tiny baby snake, put it in a fake egg, and then buried it. And the next day, when he came back, he said, "Everybody, come look, come look. There's the Esclepius has visited us. There's a snake, and I am the god's vehicle of prophecy." Now, he dubbed the snake Glykon, and Alexander ended up then not only declaring himself a prophet, but then taking requests for prophecies locally. And he used the snake as a bit of a prop and a bit of a sort of like a companion, as it were. He would drape the real live snake around himself, and then when he would withdraw to allegedly have the snake whisper in his ear, he would keep the tail of the real snake around here, and then you would have a snake puppet that looked really real. It was made with horsehair and had windpipes from cranes on the inside, so it looked like the snake was talking to him, and the snake puppet would whisper into his ear. And of course, then Alexander ended up really gaining quite a local following, and we ended up being sent cult statues. Now, Lucian ridicules not just Alexander, but what he represents, and whether or not the idea of a false prophet really can be applicable here is a whole nother question. But what's particularly interesting is that we do have archaeological evidence that around this time, a cult of Esclepius was worshipped in the form of a human-headed snake, as seen here, called Neos Asclepios Glykon, and it was primarily centered at Abanatacus. We get images of snakes identified as Glykon from everywhere from Asia Minor to Eastern Europe. They're fundamentally similar in that they have a coiled snake body, a bifurcated tail, and a human snake head. So this doesn't represent Glykon as servant of the god. This is Glykon as the god. So the god Asclepius is both serpent and god at once, as you can see by that very eerie human stare, and is oftentimes shown as curled around the healing staff of Asclepius. And so, of course, that draws on a past image of Asclepius from across the world. And we also get coins bearing the image of Glykon from across the empire. They popped up everywhere from Abanatacus to local cities. And we also get images of Neos Asclepios Glykon. And it makes you wonder if perhaps the presence of his god and his prophets locally were seen as a point of civic pride, because when you, of course, issue a coin to go across the empire, you put a symbol that is a trademark of your city on it. So the fact that we get this image on coins is rather remarkable. So after a couple of days, the population of Abanatacus gets quite large. And when the frenzy reaches a height, Alexander deigns to grace the people with his presence. As I mentioned, he takes a seat in his receiving room and lets the snake curl around his neck. He then, of course, receives the prophecies with by having the fake snake speak to him. He has petitioners write down their questions and seal up the scroll. Then he goes into his inner sanctum, pops the seal open, and or so Lucian says, and then inscribes it on a resealed scroll. Now, how really easy that would have been, I couldn't tell you, because it is very hard to reseal a scroll, but that's what Lucian says happened. And Alexander ended up giving many ambiguous responses. So just in case something didn't come true, he could claim it had been misinterpreted. Now, returning to this, number of these items are characteristic of Keith Raniere. He simultaneously raked in headlines by recruiting former celebrities and wealthy heiresses, just as Alexander would have gotten gifts and tribute from anyone visiting, or people would indeed have to pay to access his prophecies. In the guise of a self-improvement class for female empowerment, workshops for which cost $5,000 each, Raniere lured in women and reinforced traditional gender dynamics by essentially breaking women down emotionally and then saying, this is what you've got to do to be your best self. He also had an inner circle called DOS, Latin for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, translated as master over slave, by Raniere and his circle himself. The fact that he even chose to use Latin to demonstrate like a holy of holies is really interesting, and it sort of harkens back to the idea of making one's cult or faith or the philosophy legitimate by making it seem older than it is, sort of where we get with Alexander and Apollonius of Tyana by channeling an ancient language. And joining Nexium ended up always costing women, both morally, physically, every which way. And according to the New York Times, it originally had started by female members approaching others on the sly, asking if they felt stuck in their personal growth and wanted to join a secret women-only self-help society. Essentially, these were multi-level marketing schemes driven by Raniere's charisma and self-help claims, but in reality, they drew in followers bit by bit, drained them of their cash and freedom, and isolated them from their families. Now, these two women here are heiresses to the Seagram's fortunes, Sarah and Claire Bronfman, and in total, these women took allegedly $150 million from their family accounts to fund Raniere, according to an article published in Vanity Fair, who then used the funds to buy a private jet and pay his debts in the commodities market, just as Alexander would rake in the drachmae and buy elaborate robes for himself. A source tells Vanity Fair that these women had never felt close to their father, and that Raniere ended up drawing them in the guise of healing their issues of dependency. But of course, then Edgar Bronfman, their father, originally was very excited that his daughter seemed to have found a spiritual practice that they related to. But when he realized they were giving away millions of dollars, he quickly changed his tune. Now, Alexander himself raked in 70 to 80,000 drachmae per year, allegedly. Eventually his musings made their way to Rome. When high-ranking visitors would come to visit, he would quasi-blackmail people. He'd read the questions on the scroll they sent him, and then he would hold back returning the scroll, saying, basically, I know your secrets. You're asking me about intense things, and if you don't, pay up, so Lucian would say that he could blackmail them for additional funds if he so chose. Now, similar members of DOS or Nexium were also required to provide similar, essentially material that could be used to blackmail them into obedience. Compromising material, whether nude photos or false allegations about themselves. They had to come up with these things to give to their higher-ups so that if they wanted to, they could be controlled. Now, Alexander ended up pulling one over on high-achieving Roman officials, a fellow named Rutilianus, who he prophesied to grand future Rutilianus's young son. And when he asked a tutor to appoint to his son, Alexander gave him the name. Of course, this kid then died. Rutilianus was not hearing any criticism of his favorite prophet, claiming that Alexander had clearly meant his son was going to be studying with long dead Pythagoras and Homer, because when Alexander had responded, he said, have his tutor be Pythagoras or have him be Homer. So he supposedly justified this that way. And Alexander not only ended up taking money from his followers and becoming incredibly rich off of it, but also manipulated others for his own sexual antics, not unlike Keith Raniere. He advised everyone to avoid having sex with young boys, which he deemed impious, but then got all of the local cities from across Asia Minor to send him their choir boys, almost as if in tribute, and Lucian described them as having been kept under ward and treated like bought slaves, kissing them and affronting them. He made it a rule, too, not to greet anyone over 18 years with his lips. The emotional manipulation by a religious leader and abuse almost disguised as seduction are eerily reminiscent of Raniere. Some have speculated on the nature of whether or not Rainier suffered from mental illness, dubbing him a narcissist. But in my opinion, such speculation poorly treats the many who struggle with mental illness in the day-to-day world and don't treat people terribly. Similarly, Stephen Kent of the University of Alberta opines that Alexander may have been a malignant narcissist, but any attempt to psychoanalyze him based on this very tricky account is ultimately futile. Regardless of an exact diagnosis for either man, both sort of put themselves forward as masculine ideals, wise and all-knowing gurus of their time who manipulated others. Now, Alexander predicted to live to 150. He died of a rotting leg, probably gangrene at age 70. Thankfully, Rainier has also gotten his comeuppance, sentenced to 120 years in prison, but that hasn't, irreparable damage has still been done to the lives of those he manipulated. We can't say just how bad Alexander might have been, but looking to modern examples provides a chilling parallel. And here we have a coin of Glycon the snake. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carly. That was a really interesting talk. I know, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say these sort of cults are always incredibly fascinating. It's kind of, you just can't look away. There's a lot of commentary in the chat. I see one definite question. It's the most recent thing. So how wealthy was the ancient Alexander relative to our times?
That is an excellent question, one that I do not necessarily know the answer to off the top of my head. However, the idea that he was making, 72,000, he would have been essentially the equivalent of probably tens of millions of dollars at the least. But this is an estimate based on, you'd have to get back to me and I'd be happy to follow up.
Okay, I think a drachma is 4.6 grams of silver, but then you would have to
Yeah, I'd have to do all of the conversions. I imagine he'd be considerably wealthy.
He'd be, yeah. We could do the math. Let's see, 70,000 times 4.6. That's 322 kilos of silver. That seems like it'd be worth a lot. I don't know.
I imagine it would probably
back then.
For sure.
And lots of questions about the Nexium guy. I already forgot his name.
Keith Rainier, the Vanguard.
Keith Rainier, that's it. There's a great documentary series on HBO. It's really dark though. Don't watch it if you're having a bad day, but really interesting stuff. Thank you so much.